Welcome to today's special webcast. I'm Amy Abel with the Conference Board, and I'm very excited that you've chosen to join us today for this special webcast, Deciding When to Seek a New Organization Design. It's a really great topic because many of you know we're dealing with such chaos, such turbulence in our world. How do we know if we're organized and structured and aligned with our business strategy and objectives? So that's the premise of our webcast for today. And some of the critical questions that we will be addressing. What signifies that an organization redesign is the right answer to performance and strategic differentiation challenges? How do you know when it's the right time to redesign? What are the factors that lead to a successful organization redesign and business model transformations? If you have decided to transform, well, how do you support that transformation to success? And what are the key insights about how you should choose the optimal org design? So lots of fabulous questions and getting into some tactics on what we should think about from an org design perspective. And those of you, just as an admin, if you are listening in for some credits, you can see the HRCI, SHRM, and CPE credits. Please type your name in the lower right-hand box and click on the pop-up boxes as they appear throughout the webcast, and we will definitely credit you for the credits. Okay, so with that, before I forget, you can also download the presentation, which is in the middle of the screen there. Download this presentation. You can view it at your own leisure. And throughout this webcast, I will be inviting you to join me into the conversation, so please type your name in, type your question in the lower left-hand box and join us. We'll be really excited to take your comments and questions and feed this into the webcast. And finally, let me introduce my guest for today, Reed Deschler, who is principal of Align Org Solutions. He works with executive and human resources teams to define winning strategies, and he helps also align organization and business models for success and mobilize employees and stakeholders. He has guided numerous Fortune 500 organizations such as Tyco, 3M, Abbott Laboratories, Hertz, Cummins, Cisco, USAA, to name just a few. And finally, he is a co-author of Mastering the Cube, Overcoming Stumbling Blocks and Building an Organization that Works. I think he is a terrific person to talk to about this topic. So first, Reed, thank you so much for joining me today on this webcast.
Thanks, Amy. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm really looking forward to today's discussion. So, are we ready to dive in?
Yeah, let's dive in. So why don't I turn it over to you? Give us a little background and a little foundation, and we'll certainly invite the audience to join us in this conversation as we go along.
Absolutely. Well, thank you again. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm grateful that there are so many people listening in today, and I hope, as Amy invited you, that you'll chime in with your questions and comments, and we'll do our best to make this a free-flowing dialogue. To get things kicked off, a few people may not be familiar with Align Org Solutions. One of the things that gives me a little bit of credibility in this topic area is that we as a firm specialize in helping organizations conduct organization redesigns. And so, 100 times a year or more, we're working with organizations to go through some type of organization redesign. And as Amy indicated, we do this sometimes with very large, complex, global organizations. Sometimes we'll do it more with a function or with a small business unit within a company. But regardless of when and how we conduct these organization redesigns, one of the questions that obviously comes up quite a bit is an organization redesign actually going to help? And so that's what really spurred today's conversation around when is a good time for us to consider a new organization and when is it not. And so that's kind of what we want to delve into today. Now, just to get level set, one of the things that I want to make sure that we're all pretty clear on is when we say the words organization design, a lot of the folks that we may interact with immediately equate that to structure. And I want to go on record as saying that I don't equate that immediately to just structure. Organization design is a bit broader topic. In our book, Mastering the Cube, we create an analogy between an organization, which is obviously a very complex entity, with a Rubik's Cube, which is also in its own right somewhat complex. If anyone's ever tried to solve the Rubik's Cube, it's not a simple endeavor unless you happen to know the right sequence and order and algorithms to actually do that. But what we do like about the Rubik's Cube analogy is that just like an organization, a Rubik's Cube is multidimensional. So on a Rubik's Cube, we've got 6 sides. And in a similar way, we highlight 6 different dimensions of an organization that have to be aligned in order to drive success. One of those dimensions is certainly structure. But just putting a new structure in place without the proper work or ways of working, or without the right metrics, without the right continuous improvement measures, the right talent or rewards, or even the right culture, it's really fool's gold. You're going to end up with boxes and lines moving around quite a bit, but you're not going to end up with real lasting performance change. And so as we try to set the stage here, I think the first thing for us to acknowledge is that when we talk about an organization redesign, sometimes we have to filter out, are we really talking about a structure change, which is simply one aspect of an organization's levers for affecting change, or are we really looking at a holistic adjustment in any number of the dimensions of an organization, such as the way work's done, or metrics, or culture, or any of these other dimensions? Regardless, even if all we were doing is changing the structure, the minute you make a twist on your cube to change the structure, let's say, it has a ripple effect to other aspects of your organization. And that's another reason we love the cube analogy, because the minute I change my structure, we might think, gee, that's a pretty simple, straightforward thing to do. Most of us have experienced the ripples that come from that. One organization that I'm currently working with is going to make a shift kind of from a product line organization to a regional model. Makes a lot of sense for their business, and so they're going to do that. A few people are seeing the structural change as sort of the be-all and end-all of that effort. But there are some people who actually are working in that structure who are quite concerned about decision-making, and they're quite concerned about who's going to own decision rights. And tied to that is who's going to own operational responsibilities for metrics and P&L. When you take all those other elements into the equation, this simple structural change starts to cascade through many other aspects of the organizational cube. So when we start to think about organizations, we like to think about it as a process of achieving organization alignment. Now, perhaps counterintuitively, when we're thinking about organization alignment, we actually start with what are the results we're currently getting over on the far right-hand side of the page that I have showing right now. Once we know what those results are, if those results are great, then we might say not a lot to change. But when those results start to drift out of what we want or expect, or out of what our shareholders or other stakeholders may expect or want from us, we then are forced to jump all the way to the far left and look at our marketplace or the environment in which we operate and ask ourselves some questions about whether or not we are still set up to effectively achieve good results. And if we conclude that we're not, then there's 3 major phases that we have to think about. The first is a strategy phase to clarify how it is we want to win in the marketplace. The second is, do we have the organizational capabilities or muscles? Don't think of these as individual skill sets. Think of these as organizational capabilities that will, at a macro level, that will help us win and differentiate. And then finally, have we aligned all the rest of the operational choices in the business to achieve the outcomes and results that we're seeking? And as you can see, when we look at those capabilities and choices, we're using the organizational cube to help guide and drive the sequence and order with which we look at the different dimensions of an organization. And again, it's not just about structure. Now, before we dive into some more content here, I'm going to let Amy jump in and see if she's got some questions dialing in, and then we're going to dive into this first topic area.
Yeah, so Reed, thank you. We don't have any questions yet, but I do invite the audience to please join us by typing in your questions in the lower left-hand box. But I do have a comment, Reed, because I'm so glad that you started off with emphasizing the structure does not equal redesign. I'm often asked that very type of question, companies and executives that I work with, should we align to center of excellence? Should we align to region? Should we align to the business unit? And we get lots of these types of questions about how should we organize the structure. And I, like you, my first question back to them or comment back is almost, if that's the first question you're asking, it may not be the best question to ask. There's so many other variables and factors involved in what a design of organization really should look like. And what are all these other factors that take into effect as to the impact of the actual design of the organization. So I think that's a great way to start. Thank you for doing that. There is one quick question. Let me see if I can just read that really quickly. So the question is, how does the model you just shared align to Jay Galbraith's STAR model? Do you want to take that on for a second before we jump into the next part?
Yeah, absolutely. So when we look at the STAR model or any other org design model, maybe this McKinsey 7S or any others, have a lot of similarities to the cube that we're showcasing here. There are a couple of key differences. One, if we went back a page, and I can do this here, and looked at this model, those models are less sequential. Now, you might say, well, if all I need to do is make a minor adjustment here or there to achieve overall alignment, then those models are sufficient, and I would absolutely agree. In fact, they're the basis for so many organization alignment and design models. But as a practitioner, sometimes what we do is we jump into the wrong area of alignment first, and then we're trying to recreate the right kind of alignment sort of ad hoc or as we go. And what I like to do is make sure that we're always taking the alignment or design questions from the strategic lens first, then through the organizational capability lens second, and then thirdly through the operational or micro level choices that an organization needs. So there's a lot of similarities in the elements. So if you looked at the points of the STAR, you're going to see a lot of overlaps, a few differences in how they're grouped. But indeed, the most helpful piece for practitioners is to kind of have this sequence of events, because sometimes we are dealing with different kinds of design questions at different levels of an organization or in different parts of an organization, and the practitioner really benefits from having some guidance on where to start and then in what order and sequence to work through the different dimensions. And I saw a follow-on question in regards to continuous improvement. One analogy or synonym I would suggest for continuous improvement is just simply that continuous improvement is about keeping the organization renewed and refreshed. So we often think of it as an effort to try to fix things that are annoying or that aren't leading to the best efficiencies or costs or things like that. But in a broad sense, continuous improvement should be an effort to constantly keep your organization learning, constantly keep your organization looking for ways to do things better. And when those efforts start to dry up, then it may indeed be some time for a redesign. But we'll dive into that in a little more detail here as we go forward. Thanks for those questions.
Terrific. Yeah, no, those are great. And Reed, I would say, yeah, let's jump in, because I think actually the next question or two may directly tie into what you're trying to talk about here. How do I know that my organization needs a new org design? Please go ahead.
Yeah. Well, I'm going to start here with a quote from a noted bloggist, John Pryor, who said the following. He said, "The single best reason to reorganize is to align the structure of the organization to strategy." And you could just put full stop right there. He does go on to say, but once you move away from strategy as a driver, it begins to make less and less sense to reorganize. We often say that organizations are perfectly designed to get the results they're getting. So anytime we want to change our results or we want to achieve or drive toward a different strategy, then it may be time to examine not just the structure, but all aspects of the organization to determine whether or not they are still optimally aligned to achieve what we're looking for. So let me kind of illustrate these profound principles just a little bit more. If you think about it kind of like a roadmap or a path, starting on the left-hand side, things happen all the time in our marketplaces, no matter what kind of business we're in. Even if you're in a nonprofit, donor sentiments change, funding priorities change from governments, customers' preferences change, and so things change all the time in the marketplace. And when those change, it often, and this is why it's blue, because now it's the organization's response to that change in the marketplace, which is, what are we going to do strategically about that? Are we going to ignore it and keep doing what we're doing and just kind of put the blinders on? And I don't mean that in a bad way. I mean, there could just be some things in the market that right now don't matter, and so we're going to kind of insulate ourselves from that noise and focus on what we're good at and what we know is going to get us where we want to go. But other times, that change in the marketplace causes us to really re-question some of the things that we prioritized or the things that we thought were important. Think about some of the digitization strategies that organizations are pursuing now. We see some research now coming out that says those that are leading in digitization are actually beating their competition in very significant ways, not because they're the first, but because they have tied it very closely to their strategy. Those that are coming a little bit second and third tier into the digitization game are not doing as well, not because they couldn't do what the first movers are doing, but because they're trying to adopt it in response to what they see going on in the market, instead of using digitization as a way to enhance their delivery to customers. I know that's a little bit of a nuance, but there's just some issues, for example, around digitization and strategy. Well, the minute you change your strategy, you now have to change your organizational muscles, your capabilities, the things that you're particularly good or strong at. And you may have historically been really strong at manufacturing, but now you're moving to a world that's much more analytics driven or much more experience driven, in which case the physical products that you once anchored your entire business on might now just simply be a component of the solution that you're providing. And so now you might say, gee, why are we even making things? Why don't we outsource our manufacturing and do something else? Now, there's political sensitivities that go with all of that, but nonetheless, it begs those questions that perhaps we need to change our operating models. Once we change our operating models, then, that has a cascading effect through all the other sides of the organizational cube, and we now see misalignments emerge in how the choices in an organization are made. As we change strategy, as we change our capabilities, and as our organization choices change at a detailed operational level, inevitably the results are going to change, sometimes for better and sometimes for worse. But really the trigger for all of this is whether or not our change in strategy, which is often in response to what's going on in the market, is going to require us to re-examine all of those other organizing choices. And so that's kind of the way I like to think about it. If strategy changes, then it's likely that many of the other capability choices or detailed micro choices are going to have to change. Now I'm going to invite Amy kind of back in here, but there's a couple of rhetorical questions that I think this poses. So the first question that a leader or that a practitioner might pose for a leader in an organization is your current organization design, not your structure, but your full organization design, capable of delivering on your strategy? The second one is, if it's not capable, then what aspects of the organization are not capable or incapable? Now we look at the cube and we start to go dimension by dimension, and we say, is the work able to be done in a way that helps us win? Is our structure aligned? Are our roles clear? Is the metrics and information of our business there? And you notice I'm just going around the cube asking the questions, if my organization can't deliver what I want, what about it needs to change? And sometimes what needs to change isn't the structure, but we might still be redesigning the organization. We're just redesigning other aspects of the organization. Some of the most enjoyable redesigns I get involved in are the linkage redesigns. I'm not changing the formal structure, but I'm changing the wiring that goes on across organizational boundaries, because that's how things really get done sometimes. So those become really compelling organization redesigns. So those are a couple of rhetorical questions, obviously, Amy, that I wanted to tee up there to kind of think about, when do we need to redesign? What other questions or comments have started to come in that we want to respond to?
Sure, sure. So definitely that was one of the questions I had, which you addressed a little bit, which is around how do we go identifying and go about doing that, right? Identifying where the gaps are and which part of the cube is not aligned as well as we would like it. And you definitely gave some examples of going around the cube and asking thoughtful questions and how that might help identify where the gaps are, because there are 6 areas that we could investigate, and there could be gaps in one area or gaps in 4 areas. And so can you help, and this is one of the audience questions, can you talk a little bit about, if an organization has decided to make a change and a redesign, how do they go about it from a change management perspective? And what kind of flow or processes should they think about, really just from a change management, which, as we all know, is really hard for many organizations.
Yeah. That's a good question, Amy, and I appreciate those that are weighing in with those questions. And for simple reasons, let me break this down into 2 parts. Part 1 is the work that we do around architecting a future organization design. If we've concluded that there is a need for change and we begin to architect a new design, there is change management that is needed during that phase of the work. And there's many ways that we would advocate that you do that. One is about using a high involvement approach. Design doesn't happen, usually in smoke-filled rooms. It happens when you pull the right subject matter experts, the right leaders together, and you go through a collaborative process to evaluate design options. But to put people in a room and ask them to suspend their own self-interest and to think about what's best for the organization is sometimes a tough challenge, and there's change management involved in that. And so some of the change management is all about, how do you set the conditions for the design work and the design choices to be made effectively. Now the second part, or the second phase, is once you've decided what you want to change, now you have the big effort of trying to communicate your new logic and thinking to others in the organization to say, hey, this is a good idea, and here's some good reasons why we're going to make these changes. And a lot of people may look at that and think, well, those are not good reasons, or you don't know some things that we know, or this is going to impact me personally or my friends and colleagues. And so the other aspect of change management is how do we take our thinking and our recommendations and move them forward into action. What we do know is that unless behavior changes, results often don't follow. And we know that behavior doesn't usually change until the way that people think changes. And we know that people change the way they think because they've had an experience. And so part of what I try to think about when I'm going through a redesign process is, what experience can we create, either for decision makers or for those inheriting the design choices, that will help them begin to think about the business differently. And when they think differently, they'll often start to behave differently. When they behave differently, then the results are going to follow. So that's kind of the response I'd give on change management, Amy.
I think that that sounds right. And just to follow on, another change management related type question, which is from the audience, many leaders think that org design equals reporting structure. How do we overcome this bias? How do we help educate? How do you go into organizations and help educate the executives you're talking about and talking to that design does not equal reporting in org charts? What might be some useful things to think about for our audience?
Well, that's a great question. That very question is what inspired me and my colleagues to write our book, Mastering the Cube, a few years ago. Because we knew that not only ourselves, but many of our colleagues who were practitioners in organizations were struggling with leaders who were viewing the work as being a boxology exercise, and they were also viewing the work as being fairly quick and event-driven. In other words, we go in, we move the boxes around, we announce it, and we're done, and we can move on with our real lives. And so part of our impetus for writing the book was to highlight, and in a few minutes here I'll share a few of these, was to highlight some of the building blocks that great leaders do that set the conditions for an effective redesign. And one of the things that we talk about right from the get-go is exactly what we've been talking about in this webinar, which is that organizations are like a multi-dimensional puzzle, like a Rubik's Cube, and not just a singular dimension of looking, in this case, at the boxes and lines. So that's some of the education we do. We also spend some time talking to them about the relationship, as we talked earlier, about strategy leads to the capabilities you need, which leads to the choices you have to make. And there's a sequence there that's really important for leaders to wrap their heads around. Because if you walk into a room with a group of executives and you say to them, hey, in your career at any time, have you been a part of an organization redesign that didn't achieve results? And you ask everyone, raise your hand. You don't have to say where it is, just raise your hand. Almost everyone will raise their hand. Because of that experience that we all share, that we've made these kinds of significant changes and not gotten the results that we want, you now have an opening, I think, to help those leaders say, would you be open to considering doing it a different way, in a way that we think can help achieve results? And barring some unique personalities or conditions or circumstances, most leaders will say, absolutely, I don't want to repeat what I've experienced before in my career.
That's a great one. I can imagine, and I was intrigued that you said that's actually what led you to write the book. So I think that's awesome, because I can certainly imagine the challenges that you might have in convincing leaders, or even just helping them to understand, what it is that we're trying to talk about, that org design is so much more and so much more complicated, but still achievable. So let's dig into that a little bit. What factors will lead to a successful org redesign? If we are taking on this challenge, what are the things we should look out for? Can you share with us some of your thoughts?
Well, absolutely. Thanks for teeing that up, Amy. I guess we could write a book on this subject, and actually we did. And so rather than restate the whole book, let me just highlight a couple of things. One I've kind of already mentioned, and it's this, that what we see the best and most effective leaders and organizations do is they focus on making sure that all systems in the organization are aligned. That can be structure, it can be work, it can be continuous improvement, it can be metrics, it can be culture. They're looking at the whole system, and they don't claim success or victory if just one aspect or one side of the cube is aligned. What we see too often, unfortunately, are some of the stumbling blocks where a leader will take truly a boxology approach to things. If I can get the optimal number of layers, or if I can get the right people in the right positions or boxes, then things will obviously work better. And we just find those to be different ideas. And so what we tend to like to suggest is let's focus on the building blocks. So one is all systems. The next one you can see that I have highlighted here is making sure that we let the design precede people or staffing. Some leaders have a tendency to come into the room and think, all right, here are the people that I have at my disposal. They're currently in my organization. And, I'm going to find a place for them all, and hopefully I'll put them in a place where they can be successful and help us get results, but I am limited to the people that I have. And we would usually advocate, let's just pause for a minute and say, look, let's design what we really need. And then we can go look at our talent and people and assess, are they the right fit for what we're trying to do? Sometimes what we'll conclude is, yeah, we've got a lot of great talent. They're just not well aligned to where we need them to be playing and how we want them to be delivering value. Other times we conclude, wow, there is a whole new set of capabilities and skill sets and contributions that we need people to deliver. And the people that we have today don't have that experience, or they don't have the kind of vision that we're looking to try to pursue. And so now, instead of constraining our design, we say, let's design what we need and then find a way to match the talent to that. The third one I wanted to highlight is an interesting one. It's this issue of complexity. And this could be a lengthy topic all by itself. In fact, we did a different webinar about a month ago on this very subject. But the basic idea is this: industries in almost every sense are becoming more complex. Not only are they becoming more complex, they're moving faster. So you've got fast, increasingly more complex industries and businesses trying to respond to those. The good news is we have leaders who are saying, hey, we have a great opportunity here to make our businesses more successful by taking on some of the complexity that our customers are feeling and create a better experience, a solution. Think of these as bundles. Think of these as experiences. And we see businesses coming up around platform business models. There's lots of great things going on in this space. The thing, though, that's often overlooked is that when we take on that complexity for our customer, which is often very much appreciated, we end up adding a tremendous amount of complexity to our own organizations. And we don't design that very well. So another one of the issues that we encourage leaders to think about, and practitioners alike, is if you're going to start to take on some of the complexity of your businesses, of your customers, then you want to make sure that you've got a means of taking this work on. Now, those are just three of the real quick learnings we had from Mastering the Cube. I wanted to share two more from another little resource that we use called 66 Tips. This is 66 Tips for Organization Alignment. One of them is, when you're doing this work, be agile. So it may feel like, because I was prescribing a sequence of events, that has to be long and laborious and it has to be a waterfall approach. The reality is it can be very much the opposite. If you think about pulling a design team together, in essence what we're doing is we're putting together like a scrum team, and we're asking someone to facilitate that team working towards some minimal viable product. Things that can produce immediate value, we can then put it into practice and apply it and see if it's going to work. If it does, great, we're on the right track and we can continue forward in another sprint of activity, or we can say this isn't working and we don't get too committed to a long-term play. And the final tip I wanted to highlight was just making sure that we're really clear on what we're doing and why we're doing it. And this may seem like it's trite, but it's tried and true. This is a change management point. The rationale for organization redesigns is often not clear enough to those that are being asked to adopt it. And so we would just simply say at this stage, make sure that whatever it is you're doing, it's clear what you're doing and why you're doing it. All right.
Yeah, and Reed, I think that clarity is exactly right, which is, being clear on what and why. And I, again, sort of reemphasize when executives come to me and ask the question, should we align this way or that way? And they're specifically referring to org charts. I definitely pause and I get a little bit concerned that they're not asking the right questions. I think what you're posing are much more interesting and intentional questions around how do we actually align what we're doing to support the actual strategy. And that might result in some org structure changes. Before you move on, let me toss you another audience question. And I love it because the audience is actually interacting with each other, so for that. The question was, can you distinguish between how you define an operating model versus the org design in this conversation. And another audience member chimed in a little bit, and I'd like to hear your thoughts, which is, operating models tend to look at people, processes, technologies, products and services, whereas org design might be about how you leverage the resources and align the resources to support that operating model. Do you have the same take or perhaps a different take on an operating model versus an org design?
Yeah, it's a great set of questions that were teed up. Let me try to take a crack at these because there's certainly a lot of ways to interpret these topics. If you thought back to the model I showed you several slides ago that talked about strategy, capabilities, and choices, or the strategy clarification, the macro alignment, and the micro alignment that I walked through, I think about the capabilities or the macro alignment part of the design process as being really your operating model level of discussion. Making those decisions about what are the ways that people, process, technology, markets, segments, other key strategic issues, products, services, how those are all really brought together in a way that's going to create value in a sustainable sense. That's part of that macro level or that capabilities level design work. As you proceed past that into more of the micro level choice making, now you might argue, well, isn't that the org design piece? Well, it certainly is, because that's where we're really going to get down to the resource level and determine where they're going to be placed, how they're going to be organized, what decision rights they're going to have, how they're going to do their work, how they're going to be measured, and so on and so forth. But to assume that that whole equation from strategy to capabilities to choices is not org design, I think is probably trying to create a box too small. I like to think about that whole thing as really being about achieving organization alignment. I'll often needle some of my HR colleagues and say, the only reason that a business needs us is because we do something that business needs. Because the minute that business decides they don't need a talent review, or they don't need to hire someone, or they don't need to file one of the ERISA forms each year, is the minute that we no longer have value we can provide. And so when I think about this, it is a highly interconnected chain of events that once a business says, here's how we want to win, the operating model that we set up is a design set of questions. It's just at a very strategic level. And those design decisions that are made at that strategic level really set the context for how the business can be successful and operate. And then as we move to more tactical decisions about where we place our resources and how we do our work and all of that, we're really just extending that organizational alignment from the strategy all the way through the the executional and operating choices of the business. So that's kind of how I tackle that question, but it's a great one, and we could certainly dialogue on that for some time. Anything else there?
I think more questions are coming in, but in the interest of time, let me move us along. I think so far you've given us a great context of, do we need to redesign our organization? How do we think about that? As well as covering some of the factors leading to successful redesign. So I think we'd like to go into the next phase of this conversation as well. Then how do we choose? If we know that we want to redesign, how do we choose the optimal org design that might be most appropriate for our strategy and our organization? Or I should say for my strategy and my organization. How might that look like?
Yeah, it's a great question, Amy, and I'm glad that we're going to dive into this a little bit, because another one of the big flaws that I see organizations stumble into is that they seek to follow what they see around them, and so they'll look at peers or they'll look at industry best practices, they'll go to conferences, they'll read books, all great things to become informed. But I would take the position that literally every organization design has to be unique and custom to the organization and the situation that you're in. Now, you might say, well, boy, that's a lot of, discrete, unique work that you're doing to really just put something in place. that, should be done and then just become the way we operate. But the reality is the organization design is a reflection of how we think we're going to deliver results. And we kind of touched on that earlier. And so it's interesting, you go into any industry and you'll see peers doing a lot of things the same, but there's always someone who's really standing apart. For better or worse, but usually for better, they stand apart. And the reason they stand apart is because they're willing to look at their organization alignment choices, and they're really careful about them. They've made them intentionally. They've made them in the proper order and sequence. And because of that, it seems to give them an advantage in their industry. And so the first thing that I typically suggest is, let's ask the right questions. So how do I know what are those right choices I should make for my company? Well, let's ask the right questions. Now, assuming we understand where our strategy is going, so I'm already assuming those decisions have been made, which is always a big assumption. But assuming they have, now I'm ready to look at the organization alignment choices and say to myself, all right, let's start with the work. How am I going to deliver the work to be done? After I understand that and how that's going to create value, then I can move to the structure, because the structure then becomes a reinforcement to how I'm going to deliver that work. Hopefully that work's going to be differentiating and it's going to be creating value. Therefore, the structure and the linkages, which I referred to a little bit earlier, become a means of enabling the work to be done. I assign people, I assign structures, decision rights, and so forth throughout the organization so that we can get the work done. After I've gotten the structure in place, then I'm going to go to my information and metrics, and I'm going to say, how are we going to know that the people doing the work are getting the right information to make the right decisions, and that they're getting indications that they're performing the way we want them to? So our KPIs. From there, we'd go to our people and rewards, and we'd ask questions. Do we have the right talent, and are we incenting them the right way? Then we'd go to our improvement choices, and we'd ask ourselves, do we have means in our organization of keeping the organization renewed and refreshed so that we can continually add value and improve the results of the business? And then lastly, we will ask questions about culture. Is it enabling us? Are the leadership behaviors that we see in our company helping us act? If at any point in time there's a misalignment, then there's the opportunity for redesign. But more importantly, as we try to answer these questions, there are countless options. So we could pick any category, take the work category, and we say, well, how can we do this work? Pick something like incoming call centers, customers calling in, wanting information, conducting transactions. You pick your industry. Are there a lot of ways to do incoming call center work? Yeah, pretty much 1,000 ways you could do that. What's the right way? Do we want to do it the way our competitor does it? Or do we want to design a set of choices that are unique to the way we want to do things? Great question. Now, if I go to the structure, are there a few ways that I could structure my business? You bet there are. There's probably hundreds of ways that it could be done. Do I want to do it like a competitor? Do I want to do what I saw at a conference? Or do I want to create a structure that's going to help me deliver my unique work in a way that helps me win? These are the kind of questions that we like to start with. Now, let me give some further illustrations of this. Now, I want to set this page up just a little bit, because what I've tried to do is just give one example per side of the cube. These are not all inclusive. They are simply one little example. So, and they cut across different industries. So if I looked at the work side in the upper left corner, I could have a simple decision to be made around whether or not I'm going to use a physical branch or location to deliver value, or whether I'm going to offer something through a digital channel, or both. Now that's a very binary setup in terms of the question. But whether I should go physical location or digital are pretty big decisions. And we know of organizations out there that do one or the other or both, and they are extraordinarily successful. And we also know some organizations that have tried one or the other, and they don't do it very well. And so one of the things we recognize is that as we're making design choices, first of all, there's no right or wrong, but there are pros and cons. There are benefits and risks. So another illustration, if I looked at structure, should I organize around products or customers? Again, very binary option I've just put here as an illustration, but both have good things, both have trade-offs. I see organizations right now who have historically been product-centric companies deciding, should we switch and become customer-centric? And the minute they think about that at any level of depth, they are immediately confronted with some really tough questions. How are they going to drive standardization when there's not a consistent product offering or group that's being delivered? How are they going to make sure that costs don't creep out of control? Who's going to own the P&L? All of those are really important questions, but yet the promise of, if I could align my organization to really focus on a particular customer segment, it would be great. I look at information and metrics. Here's a simple, age-old question. Cost versus quality. And I can continue down some of these illustrations I've given you. It's not that cost is better than quality or vice versa. It's in my context, given my strategy, given my market and what I'm trying to do, what are the pros and cons of focusing more on cost? Or what are the pros and cons of focusing more on quality? Or how do I strike the right balance between the two? And even that has pros and cons. So I hope the notion here is starting to come up to speed. I mean, we see this in all areas. You'll notice some of the other ones I've got here. You know, I see organizations right now that are moving their talent a lot. And then I see some organizations that really believe in tenure and depth. And there's goodness in both. What's right? Well, if I read a magazine, I might be more inclined to move people around. But if I look at my strategy, and if I talk to the people in my organization about how we think we're going to win, we might actually choose to do the counterintuitive thing, which is let's build for tenure and depth, because that's going to give us a stability and a depth of expertise that our competitors may not have. So both are good, both come with trade-offs. We often see an argument sort of spring up between Lean Six Sigma and Agile as it pertains to improvement approaches, or when you get down to something as simple as leadership and culture, you know, do we shoot for more collaboration and call it more inclusive decision making, or do we go for speed? And that's not to say we can't somehow achieve some aspects of both, but there's always a pro and con to whatever design choice we make. Now, to kind of help illustrate this in a more, practical or tool-based method, what I've done here is I've taken a structure element, which is, looking at how we put organizations together. And I've listed down the left-hand side some of the common ways that businesses actually get structured, whether it's around geographies or products or customers or functions or processes or channels. You could go on with different ways that we can structure an organization. I'm literally talking the structure side of the cube now, okay? I know that we've made such a big point. This is just an example. And what I've done under the geography piece is I've said, look, here are some of the benefits and here are some of the risks if you choose to go with a geographic way of structuring. And as you can see, there's good things and there's potentially challenging or difficult things. It doesn't give you the answer. What it gives you is an awareness of what I'm going to get or what I'm going to trade off when I strive to make a decision that I think is going to best align with my strategy. Now, in a minute, I'm going to...
Can I jump in here for a second? Because I think there's a really relevant question around this, which is earlier you did speak about sort of answering, when do I know I need to redesign my org design? And you talked about sort of changes in strategy, changes in the world, changes in business impacting that. But a more nuanced question to that is, when do you, what might be some symptoms that you can either see or observe or feel even that might be a result of a suboptimal org design? Because you're talking about benefits and risk, right? And everything will have pros and cons and good and bad. But how do you know when it's really not the right design for your organization? What might you be seeing or thinking or assessing?
Yeah, good question. Thanks for interrupting with that, Amy, because that's an important one. I'm going to give a few examples, and the list of possible symptoms is conceivably endless. For example, speed of decision making. Any organization that we see struggle to make decisions, you could argue, have some potential misalignments. Now, sometimes that decision making is slow on purpose, and we've designed it that way so that we don't make rash decisions or so that we're including all the right parties in decisions. But oftentimes, organizations are really slow just because they're really slow. They include people that don't need to be involved. It's not clear who has the decision right on something. There's multiple people with decision rights who all think they have a say on the issue. Those are just some of the signs that we see. Another sign that we see is the proliferation of linkages. So if you think about an organization having a formal structure, it kind of works hierarchically, then the linkages being sort of that, wiring that kind of cuts across the organization and helps enable things to get done across the hierarchy. Sometimes when a structure or hierarchy isn't working well, we end up putting more and more cross-boundary wiring in. And over time, that gets sort of complicated. We have, in fact, if you think about your own organizations, you might find yourself in more meetings, more decision-making committees, more project teams, more liaison roles, more, councils, you name it, because it's not clear how decision-making is made through the formal structure. So we see a proliferation of mechanisms to try to help enable that, which just sometimes adds complexity. Another example is we see a lot of use of best practices that, and I have to be careful on this one, or benchmarks, that don't seem to fit what the business is really trying to do. So I've been inside of organizations where there's a tension going on. One part of the business is saying, we want to be customer focused. I'm using this as an example. We need to really take care of our customer. At the same time, the organization is trying to adopt a cost benchmark. Now, the people trying to make a decision are conflicted over whether or not I should be focused on the customer or I should be more focused on what it costs to deliver the work or the service. Both are relevant issues, but because that's not been resolved, there's tension in the organization. So those are just a few examples, Amy, and we could probably talk for another 2 hours, and I know we have about 8 more minutes on that subject. I'll let you come back if there's another question you wanted to delve into.
You know what? Why don't you cover the next slide? And I do have another question after that. But yeah, I just wanted to get into that next conversation. But please go ahead.
Okay. Well, this will be a quick wrap then. So whenever we're trying to close things out and thinking about the organization, we do want to remember that value is created when the organization's choices, and all of them, think of them as the work and the structure and the information and metrics, the people and rewards, the culture and leadership, and the continuous improvement, when they're all aligned and they're differentiating. And as we do that, we start to really create a formula that can lead to success long-term for an organization. So, in some respects, that's just kind of where I wanted to wrap up, is just remembering, there's a process to making design. There's some tips and trades for doing this right, avoiding the effort on boxology, making sure that we're using agile approaches, and then just making sure that we're weighing those pros and cons and not trying to copy others or other things. So that's kind of where I wanted to wrap sort of content, Amy. So let's dive back into some questions if we could.
Terrific. And if the audience can see that there are some more tips that we just hinted at, so please go ahead and take a look at that website for those 66 organizational alignment tips. But the question came in around these linkages and this wiring, and you just started talking about that again a couple of minutes ago, where there's org structures, and you did articulate a little bit more about this extra wiring that goes into place. So can you give us an example or just a rough more thoughts around it? Because you did hint earlier that this was some of the best work that you've done, that you've improved linkages without actually changing the org structure. What did that look like, or how did that evolve? And just can you share a quick little story, because we only have a few more minutes?
Yeah. So one story that I share a lot is with a company that was historically a manufacturing company, and they obviously were organized around their product lines. And what they started to realize is that their customer dynamics and demographics were changing, and so they decided to realign a good part of the company toward the customer. It was a pretty bold move. The minute they did that, some of the traditional functions or areas in the company were, in essence, dismantled. Take something like marketing or product development. In a product-centric world, those things tend to be housed in those product areas. Well, if we moved away from product areas and we moved more to a customer alignment, we took something, and I'll just pick on the pricing aspect of a business. The pricing no longer had a singular home in the organization. There wasn't a marketing function the way that it had historically existed. So now pricing kind of was just hanging out there. So you might say, well, gee, Reed, that's a really bad structural design you helped them come up with if there's not a home for pricing. But in this particular case, we were looking at some formal structural things, as well as the linkages. But what we found is, through the wiring we put in place with that structure, we were able to have a home for the pricing decisions. And what was interesting is the pricing decisions actually became more robust. In the past, they tended to be sort of, well, it's a new year, so we're going to pass on a price increase. That'll help cover our additional costs and maybe pick up a little more margin. Well, now, as the organization was aligning around customers, we started to see the organization having more robust discussions about their pricing. And the way they did this is they created a council where they had pricing council. They assigned a chair of the council. They then set up different inputs for the council to consider as it pertained to pricing decisions. And then they defined what would come out after a pricing decision was made. And usually it wasn't an actual executable decision, but it was a set of guidelines that then others in the organization could use to set prices to the customer, or to offer discounts, or to put promotions together, things of that nature. So that's just an example of some of that wiring, but it was done very intentionally to help enable the organization to work.
That's a great story, Reed. I really appreciate that, because I think we often will have an org structure in this case that obviously does have some gaps, because as you noted, all org structures have benefits and risk. And so this is a pricing risk, and I can actually envision where some organizations will just suffer through that without thinking of the wiring and the linkages that you've just mentioned. And, sure enough, a year later, they're just going to reorg because they'll say, oh, that org structure obviously didn't work for whatever reason. But actually, it's building those linkages and that wiring. It's a very more nuanced view for org structure and org design that perhaps many of us don't think about. And I'm really glad you highlighted that, because it just tells us how we need to emphasize not only the structure, but then what are the perhaps risks around that structure, and what are the specific and nuanced solutions to support those gaps. And not best practices will work for every organization. It has to be what works for your organization, and how do we implement that in a successful way. So, no, that's terrific. Thank you. I really, just in the interest of time, wanted to thank you, Reed, again. It was terrific having you on. It was a great conversation, and you gave us some very tangible tips to think about in terms of implementing, assessing, identifying gaps, and even how to try to overcome some of the obstacles that we have. So thank you again, Reed, for joining us in this conversation.
Thanks, Amy. It's been a pleasure, and by all means, reach out if you have other questions you want to delve into.
Terrific. And to the audience, just wanted to thank you again for joining us. You can see there's a slide for a discount on an upcoming conference if you'd like to join us. It was just great to have all your engagement, so thank you for all of you typing in and joining in the conversation. It's always terrific to have terrific audience engagement, so thank you for that. I'm Amy Abel, I'm Managing Director here at the Conference Board, and I was delighted to have you join me, and I hope you have a good day.